the way we are treated. Can you speak about the importance of imagery to mind control, the images that are put out?
Well, certainly. First of all, a Hotep, to the family Hotep brothers and sisters, Dr. Leonard Jefferies Jr. Addressing these questions, and my African stool name is Nana Kwekujwa Ajiman II of the Ogogo stool in Ashanti. I raised that because we're talking about perception, so it's important to understand that even though my roots are in America, I have very strong ties to Africa. And I am, as one would say, a Pan-Africanist. So the perspective that I'm bringing to these questions come from that foundation. Mm-hmm. And they also come from having been one of the forerunners in the last several decades, laying down the parameters of what we are calling African-centered education, African-centered understanding, and African-centered development. Question of image. Image is key and crucial. Image affects development. And just by understanding some phrases we use all the time, I use it, for example, what Africans can conceive, they can achieve. And that implies that you have the ability of the mind to conceive wonders and achieve them. We also understand in the common culture, like Bob Marley, that Africans have been subject to mental slavery. And so even though we may be free of chattel slavery and chains are not on our arms and legs, but the chains are on our minds. So the whole question of mental slavery becomes one of the concepts we need to deal with. And then we need to understand the processes that were put in place for mental slavery to be achieved. And we look at the processes, we have to raise the question of how important is imaging? And I clearly say to my classes, whoever controls the images controls the self-esteem, the self-respect, and the self-development. In order for my students and the people I usually speak to and lecture to appreciate this, I suggest that to process this enormous information about African peoples and to process the information about the world, we need to use what I refer to as the pyramid analysis. Mm-hmm. The triangular shape of the pyramid provides a framework of analysis for me. It allows me to use that triangular shape to deal with the question of the law of opposites. At one polarity of the base of the pyramid is what I call the thesis, the foundation. At the other polarity is what I would call the antithesis, the opposite. And so there is a basic law of the universe that Dr. Ben has taught us and others have taught us applies to looking at our history very meaningfully. It references the laws of opposites. Mm-hmm. So there are several important laws that need to be uncovered for us to appreciate life in the universe, and specifically our role on this environment called the planet Earth. So when we use the question of images, it becomes very important. Self-esteem is how you feel about yourself. Mm-hmm. And if the images are negative, then your feeling about yourself has one strike. Self-respect is how you feel about yourself and others that, for example, are like you. And if the images of negativity are such that you have a negative self-esteem and you have negative respect, then you've got two strikes. In the ball game of life, you're only allowed 3 strikes if you want to use a baseball idiom. So when you go to the top of the pyramidal process, mm-hmm. and you deal with the question of development, if your self-esteem is negative, if your self-respect is low or negative, then you are caught up into what I refer to as arrested development. Mm-hmm. Self-development does not have the foundation to take you to higher understanding and to higher achievement because your models are low. I deal with this in terms of using the pyramid again, the question of socialization and acculturation. The foundation of who and what you are has two important dimensions. Let's use the pyramidal framework again. On one side of the pyramid, the most important and fundamental part of your development comes from your biogenetic inheritance. We have to have a scientific understanding of who and what we are in order to appreciate who we have become and what we can possibly do to reshape our lives and continue its development. So you have to have a scientific understanding of your biogenetics, the package of material that you've inherited from your mother's side and your father's side. So you began as a cell in your mother's womb after impregnation by your sperm of your father. And that biogenetic package includes an equal contribution from your mother, 23, and an equal contribution from your father, 23. And that 23 is combined and synthesized into 46. 46 chromosomes. And that's your start in life. That's your foundation. It's from this basic foundation that you will develop. And so you have to have a biogenetic, a scientific understanding of who and what you are. And we have to understand the processes of biogenetic development. And the new scientific breakthroughs, particularly DNA studies, are now unlocking a world that was hidden from us because we didn't have the technology and whatnot to see. But now biogenetic, the drama in the cell, the drama in the molecules, the drama in the various systems of your body, you need a cellular analysis. You need to go into yourself and understand your subatomic development. And so this can only be done with a fine-tuned scientific foundation, and the base of science is mathematics. And so we have to begin to have a different perception of the laws of the universe and the unveiling of these laws and the application of these laws to life and development on the planet and in the cosmos. So when I have the pyramidal framework, which allows us to deal with the laws of opposites, which allows us to deal with polarity and duality, because our life begins with a basic duality, a mother principle and a father principle. The interaction of that mother principle and the father principle produces a synthesis. Thesis begets antithesis, and antithesis and synthesis begets a synthesis. So you are the process of synthesizing. And your mother contributes 23 molecules, your father contributes 23, and you become a synthesized 46. And in that 46 of that cell, the nucleus of that cell, are the formulas that you will be able to develop by. Your DNA, the knowledge of what you can become, has already been put in place. Now, that's one part of your nature. That's the biogenetic component. But another part of your nature and development is what we can refer to as the nurturing part of development, the socialization, the acculturation. And so you are the product of a dual process, a foundation of biogenetics and processes put in place to help that biogenetic package develop. And that means you have to have a fine-tuned sociology, a socialization, and acculturation. Again, looking at socialization and acculturation, which is nurture. What are the values and the processes and the life experiences that go to make you you? How do we define socialization and the socialization process? For me, socialization becomes that process by which you develop your beliefs, your values, your role models, your patterns of behavior. How do you become what you become? So alongside of this biogenetic process, you have a psychological, sociological process, and that's the nurturing. So nurturing and nature go together to make you you. Our great tragedy is that we don't have a full understanding of this, so the processes that should be put in place to enhance the greatest possible development of you doesn't take place. So the human develops at a low level of 10 or maybe 15%. They even say 10 or 15% of the brain is developed. We never expand the brain to the greater development. But there are processes that enhance that, and there are procedures that will further that. And there are individuals who, by circumstances of their development, have expanded their minds to a much greater extent than any of us. And I think when we talk about one of our great members of our community, Dr. Gabriel Aibo, he, by dint of his life and his development, has been on a fast track, not even fast track, a super highway of mind development. And so he has become one of the greatest thinkers of our time. And so we need to study Dr. Oyibo and who he is, so we get a full understanding that he's one of those privileged individuals to go on this super highway to master this knowledge, and he has the commitment to bring it back to help the people in greatest need, that are peoples of color, African peoples, who are restoring their humanity. And this becomes a special mission for him because we, as the mothers and fathers of humankind, have been on this monumental restoration of our humanity. And we need, at various junctures of this enormous restoration, the tools and the ideas and concepts that would help us complete this process and go beyond. And so I appreciate having had the experience of being a part of this brother's life, Dr. Gabriel Oyibo, and hope that in the future great things will come out of his contribution. He has a sacred mission, and you develop a sacred mission through your psychological, sociological dimensions of your life. Something is instilled in you that enhances this innate package that you've inherited, that allows it to flower. And so people like myself can understand that the ideas that I had in my mind as a child did not come from me. They were processed by me. And there was a flow in me from the outer environment that I was a part of. And the major person impacting on you and inputting ideas and concepts would be your parents, particularly your mother, or your grandparents, the significant others in your family. And so as I developed the pyramidal frame of reference, which allows us to deal with thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, we have to become synthesizers. Another concept of the law of opposites, duality, polarity, has to do with the question of positives and negatives. And the synthesis of positives and negatives can be a positive or negative. So we have to understand that law of action, reaction, and negative and positive. And so there's a basic scientific foundation that life is all about, that many of us have not had properly programmed and presented to us, so we can't expand our minds the way we should and to make a contribution. So a model like Gabriel Oyibo, who is an ordinary brother, who has been on an extraordinary path of achievement. He is someone we can relate to and love and interact with. And the fact that he is among us with this great work that he's doing is extraordinary. And I'm blessed, and I feel blessed to be a part of his extended family. Now, thesis, antithesis, synthesis is a way of letting us relate to what I call systems analysis. All things are systems related. And so, in order to appreciate systems, you need a scientific approach. In order to make that scientific approach be meaningful, you need a mathematical foundation. So we have to begin to see that you need this scientific foundation in relationship to a sociological, psychological foundation, and the two wedded together will produce a new person, a made-over person who now can tap into great potentiality. And the foundation that your parents build on is a limited one, because you can't teach what you don't know. And the parents instill a sense of internal strength. You see, in order for someone to move, in order for movement to be sustained, in order for a system to be to generate itself, there has to be internal strength. And so this applies to the various systems that make up our body. It applies to the various social systems that make up our world. It applies to the various ecological systems that make up our environment. It applies to the cosmic systems that make up this larger process that we are part of. So in order to appreciate thesis, antithesis, synthesis, in order to appreciate what I refer to as the package from nature and the package and the processes from nurture, we have to see those two synthesizing. You have to have an inheritance from nature in order to achieve great things. But if you don't have the nurturing of your package, your biogenetic package, then your level of achievement will be limited. Other peoples and other groups have put in place cultural dynamics that allow them to extend further than others their achievement as individuals, families, and groups. And so systems analysis becomes key to this. I keep harping to my students, you've got to have a systems analysis. You can't be wedded to and perpetually tied to a paralysis of analysis. And when you only see things in a narrow way, and you only see things in one dimension, and you don't have the ability to link things together, then you get a paralysis of analysis. By having the triangular shape of the pyramid as the basis for processing information, you immediately have to link one polarity with another polarity, break it down, analyze it, and then pull it together. I say you go to the top of the pyramid to the capstone. And then going to the top of the pyramid to the capstone and looking at thesis, antithesis, and their interrelationship, you have to raise 7 issues. Caps, concepts, the grouping of ideas and knowledge into a certain relationship. C. To A, analyses, the various views on knowledge. You can't see knowledge in one dimension. You have to see it from various dimensions. And so you've got to have an analytical understanding of searching for various views. So concepts, you group ideas and knowledge into a certain relationship. And then analyses, you look at these concepts from various perspectives. And then you have to understand that all knowledge is interrelated and worked on by various elements. And so you have to see processes. There is biological genetic processes in reference to knowledge. There are sociological processes in relationship to knowledge. And there are psycho-spiritual elements in relationship to knowledge. So you've got to be able to understand these different dimensions and weave them together. So you have concepts, the grouping of ideas and knowledge into a special relationship. Analyses, viewing the ideas and knowledge from various perspectives. And processes, the forces affecting ideas and knowledge, economic, political, social, psychological, cultural, mechanical, theoretical, mathematical, cosmic forces affecting ideas and knowledge. And then you have to see all of this interrelated into systems. The first and most significant system you need to study is yourself. And to understand that there are various systems in your body, a multiplicity of systems that relate to each other. And if they do not relate to each other, your system dysfunctions. Or it functions at a low level, and you can't achieve your fullness. And so the systems analysis becomes key. Looking at yourself and looking at the world through concepts, analyzing it from various perspectives, including this scientific perspective that I'm talking about, that will allow you to look at things deeper, and a mathematical foundation for that is key. And then the processes that are affecting, there are certain laws of the universe and laws of nature that affect processes, and there are certain man-made processes that affect this interrelationship of things. And then, of course, we have to see it as a linker. Systems in your biogenetic package, inheritance, there are various systems that are going to allow you to be human and allow you to manifest this humanity and allow you to take it to the level of a cosmic understanding of the creation and the creator. And so we fail to utilize all that we have by not understanding these things. And so when you breathe, you intake oxygen, but processes have to take place. In order for that oxygen to be absorbed into the bloodstream, and then these processes have to, after the bloodstream absorption takes place, then the oxygen that came into your system and absorbed into your bloodstream now has to go into various aspects of your being so that the various systems can be fed. And so there's a whole process of input and output. And if you are scientific and regular and systematic in how you deal with these things, you can enhance life and how you live it and how you manifest it. In order for us to relate the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and these three elements and systems analysis, I also put a circle in the inside of the pyramid triangular shape, and then I put a circle on the outside, so you have a double circle. And my wife, who's into African art and culture and into the meaning of symbols, etc., that double culture relates to the consciousness of the Creator, or what we understand as God. And so, but for me, in using it, it allows our people to have an approach where you have to have an internal analysis. And the inner circle represents internal analysis. The outer circle represents external analysis. Internal, external analysis go together as you analyze and look at things and the world and yourself. And so you have to, now blessed by science, we have the ability now to have an internal analysis that takes us all the way to the subatomic level. And the work that Dr. Oyibo and others are doing reflects that. That's an area that only certain people who've been developed enough can really appreciate and understand that. But that's where we have to all go. We have to appreciate there's a drama taking place in our life in the subatomic level, in the cells of our body. Then we have to understand that this drama that's at the subatomic level is also taking place externally. And externally means that we have to begin to understand that life is linked up to a larger force which is almost beyond comprehension. And so we have to understand that there's a cosmic external level that complements the subatomic internal level. And in order for things to be right, that cosmic level, because it's one of the mysteries of the universe, we don't understand it, and those mysteries we try to explain by various phenomena. So we've created concepts of God at one level and science at another level, but the full understanding of the cosmic level is something that we've yet to fully understand and grasp. And so the work of Dr. Oyibo is important to help us begin to understand this cosmic level and the relationship of the external to the internal, because there is a reflection of what's happening cosmically internally. A perfect example of this drama is that when that cell, the melanized sperm of the father impregnates the melanized egg of the mother, and you begin as one cell and become a multiplicity of billions of cells that are constantly renewing themselves all the time. This drama that takes place with the cell creates the first foundation, linking DNA, RNA, and the organizing molecule of the cell, melanin. And in order to appreciate melanin, you have to understand there are two major dimensions of this phenomenon that we refer to as the organizing molecules, melanin. there is an internal dimension that goes all the way to the subatomic level that helps melanin, this blackness, this special part of human development, make the most important parts of the cells and the systems and the organs of your body fulfill themselves. So subatomically, melanin is in the sperm that produces and the egg that produces life. It's in the vital organs. It's in the brain. It's in the heart. It's in the eyes. Melanin as a phenomenon is now being studied. And 20 or 25 years ago, in 1987, they formed the Melanin Consortium, Chemware in San Francisco, around these scholars and scientists and leading lights like Dr. Ben and Dr. Park helped to galvanize these brothers and sisters, and they began to look systematically at this phenomenon of melanin. But so internal melanin has an enormous drama helping to enhance the potentiality of the body. But melanin also comes from the outside. It is the cosmic level of melanin that comes from the ultraviolet rays of the sun that produces the blackness and brownness that is called epidermal melanin. So you have neuromelanin on the inner subatomic levels of the body, and you have epidermal melanin, which helps you relate to the cosmos and to the creation. So just on the simple thing of our color, we can try to explain the deepness of looking at things from various levels and with various dimensions. And key to understanding the internal dimension is if something is going to be sustained, it has to come from the inside. Basically, for me, the outside can stimulate. The outside can bring in the nutrients, but it's the processes on the inside, the internal dimension, that creates the sustaining of life. And so we need our whole learning processes need to be turned upside right. And we've got to think this thing through in terms of what we really want to have on the planet as learning. We're not getting learning now. And we're not getting the type of learning and the type of transmission of knowledge that creates the internal dynamic to produce the superhuman. Not in the sense of the Nazis producing a Superman to dominate others, but to manifest the fullness of self and the achievement of self. There has to be an understanding of what happens inside. So one of the common things we talk about is garbage in means garbage out. So if you flip that upside right, you have to understand that nutrients in means a healthy body. And so, but if we put a scientific analysis to what we intake, there's no scientific understanding of it. We intake garbage. And our systems are such that they can begin to process this, and they do, to keep us alive, but at a low level and not an enhanced level. And so we have to change to enhance the biogenetic package that we have. You have to have an understanding of nutrients to help the systems fulfill themselves. And then you have to understand the importance of the mental processes that comes out of the psychological, sociological, that we've got to develop our minds. One of our great symbols of struggle for the restoration of African humanity is this great brother from South Africa. We always talk about Nelson Mandela, and he needs to be praised and honored. He represents the ability of Africans to survive even the most devastating destruction. But there was a young brother who could not have he did not have the chance to live a long and fulfilled life because he was taken from us with the racist struggle in South Africa and the dehumanization processes that were taking place there. But he left us with powerful images of struggling for fulfillment and powerful words. Images, they always say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So we understand the importance of image. So I always want to raise Nelson Mandela and then alongside of him, Winnie Mandela. But around them, I want to raise the Steve Bikos of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So this young brother, Steve Biko, was killed. His mind was bashed out of its brain but his spirit still lives. So there's a psycho-spiritual dimension that Steve Biko is still in the realm of the living because of the life that he lived and the sacrifices that he made. And the powerful words he left created an image for me that stimulated my internal development and my intellectual understanding. And I wrote it in a book. I left his words powerfully in a book that I wrote on South Africa, The Crisis in South Africa. And those words were, the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. Mm. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And so people are able to enslave you and oppress you and exploit you because they manipulated the mind. And so when we understand what has happened to us over the last 400 or 500 years, it is that people not only control our land, our labor, and resources, they controlled our mind, our body, and our spirit. And so if we're going to fulfill self, we've got to struggle for a return, a restoration of the African mind, the African body, and the African spirit. And in the development of the African mind, fundamentally, it means the destruction of mental slavery that has been a planned conspiratorial process. We talk about the Willie Lynch, but that's just a peep at what this is. It's a much deeper process of controlling, as you say, images that control perception, that control sense of mission. Because if you understand what we're trying to say is you can't develop a sense of mission if someone else controls your history. Whoever controls the history controls the vision. Whoever controls the vision controls the sense of mission. So you can't develop that sacred mission that you need to continue to move on the planet with other like beings to a drumbeat of the creator and the creation if someone has said that you're not even a part of the creation, that you're not even human, that in our sacred texts you are the hewers of water and the carriers of wood, or whatever that phrase is. And when you look at the American history and the history of the white world, they systematically began to exploit African peoples and Native American peoples and then put in place the thinking that we were not human. Mm-hmm. So in order for them to maintain their domination, I call it domination, destruction, and death, they systematize that process. Mm-hmm. Our great struggle has been to build for eternity, to reflect the creation and the creator. And so our great development as the foundation of the human experience, the mother and fathers of humanity, has been to have an internal dimension that's centered around spirituality. Mm-hmm. And the relationship of things spiritual, mind, body, and super spirit, the great spirit relationship. Mm-hmm. Our great dilemma is that there is also another process. Well, you have the spiritual process, you have the material process. And the difficulty I see in looking at the world is that African people somehow understood the significance of the spiritual process as the major focus of the human experience that is necessary to dominate the material process. Mm-hmm. And when the spiritual process dominates the material process, great things can be achieved. Witness the great pyramid, the building in the Nile Valley, the great temples in the Nile. Mm-hmm. So you have this monumental building materially, but the movement that creates it and sustains it is spirituality. Right. So when you see the great monuments of the Nile, you can't gawk at the monumental size, the greatest building in human history, or the conception. The persons who conceived of this and achieved this, what Africans can conceive, they can achieve, was thinking cosmically, beyond their human dimensions, beyond the physical dimensions of the human. They was thinking spiritually in trying to relate to the great spirit of creation and the creator and the creation. So we have to begin to understand that the European has mastered material domination of things and seems to be shortchanged on the spiritual end. Right. Now we've got to study this. Yeah. I'm just making this as a general framework of reference. But we really need to study what did 30 or 40,000 years of a cave experience do to the psyche of the human that's caught into that environment and is not allowed to appreciate on a daily basis the creation and the creator, and is caught at the level of what I call survival culture, where you've got to go inside, but you can only achieve at a certain level. So cave culture, if we think that the last 400 or 500 years has had a devastating effect on African peoples because of the processes that were put in place to destroy our humanity, let's look at not 400 or 500 years of enslavement. Let's look at 30 or 40,000 years in the caves of Europe, in an environment in which you couldn't speak to the creation because you couldn't see or feel it. If you're on a river bank in the southern hemisphere, meaning the Nile River, the Niger River, the Zambezi River, the Congo River, or you're in the lakes and rivers of Central and South America, or you're in the Mesopotamian Tigris-Euphrates area, or the Ganges River and the Indus River in India, or the lakes and rivers of China, you can see and feel the creation. You can relate internally to the creation and externally to it. For example, Africans along the Nile began to study the movement of the heavenly bodies and develop the mathematic formulas around the heavenly bodies and began to see the regularity and the systemic relationship. And so they began to lay the foundations for great science and the products of science. Now, they also began to relate psycho-spiritually to this development. It was a practical measure also, because if the Nile overflowed and you had to move out of the way of the Nile, because materially, if you stayed in the Nile way, you would die. So you had to devise a means of understanding when this Nile was going to overflow, began to move important things out of the way of the Nile, and move to higher ground. So in order for you to appreciate the Nile, you could stand there and you could study it, and you could actually put a stick in the Nile and watch when it overflows. But if you want a more systematic understanding of what happens internally in Africa to the Nile, you need to go externally to the universe. And you need to study. African summer out there began to study the stars and the movement of the heavenly bodies, began to relate a cluster of stars in the heavens over here as the Nile began to receive the living waters of inner Africa and from the lakes of Central Africa and living waters from the highlands of Ethiopia, all coming together in a mighty stream of life in this great river called Happy by the ancient Africans, but the Nile by us in the modern day. And this overflow could be seen as a negative, or it could be seen as a positive, or both. And you use your mind to figure out how do you enhance the negative, the positive, and how do you diminish the negative. And so studying the movement of the heavenly bodies would allow you to see the Nile rising. And the Nile would rise, and at a certain point when the heavenly bodies were here, the Nile would overflow. And then for a period of time, as you saw the heavenly bodies move through the skies, in 40 days, the flooding of the Nile would lay down, and months would lay down the sediment that would allow for crops to occur. So at a certain period of time, you could plant your crops when the set of stars are here. And then after a period of time, you could have a harvest. And so you began to relate the microscopic analysis of the universe to the subatomic analysis of what happens inside the earth to produce systems and processes and systems that produce a crop. Now, as your mind expands to this understanding of things spiritual and things material, you began to relate the movement of the heavenly bodies, not to just the drama of the cosmos and the subatomic analysis of the environment, you begin to relate these processes and these laws to the humanity. And you begin to see, as you water your wife and your partner, the heavenly bodies are in this position. And then after a period of months, she's growing with child, and the heavenly bodies are in this position. And then after the term of 9 months or so, the heavenly bodies are in this position, and then as you read the universe, you know that a child is to come. And in many instances, they tell us that the water is not going to break until the universe and the moon is in a certain level, and the magnetism of the moon and the relationship between the earth and the moon and the other heavenly bodies affects the birth of the child. So as you see the goodness and the spirituality and the blessings of the universe with the flood and the crop, you begin to think of a creator and a creation, something greater than oneself, something beneficent, something that's going to give. And then as you relate the human drama with the impregnation of the female and the growth of the child, and then after a period of time, here comes out of the female a crop, which is new life. And then you begin to relate the goodness of the universe to the goodness of the human family, particularly the woman who produces this continuation of the blessings. And so the Africans and the Nile understood that, so there's a dramatic image of the goddess Nut stretched across the temples of the Nile, with her feet planted on the ground, and her body and her legs being raised up. And then you have her private parts, the womb, and then you have the rest of her body cross the ceiling, and then you have her breast, and then you have her arms reaching down. So this dramatic image of the woman, human woman, related to the God woman and to the creation and the creative process is the most magnificent thing to understand that our people conceive that. And then to relate the center of our universe, which is the sun, to the woman. And so you have her swallowing the sun as it sets. And with the 12 hours of passage of the sun through the underworld, the sun is given birth to by the woman as it rises. And so the drama of sunset and the birth of the sun in the morning is related to the birth processes in the female. Extraordinary understanding of the God within relating to the God without. Of the drama in the subatomic level internally with the drama that takes place externally. And that's what you have to use to see our world that we created. And that world comes out of a spiritual understanding that spirit dominates the material. You see, when you see the great African symbol of rebirth, and all life is a process of rebirth, constantly, every cell is being reborn and renourished, etc. And the Africans created an eternal, perpetual symbol of that process called the Teken. We call it the obelisk. Okay, and that represents, for me, as I teach the input of knowledge and the processing of knowledge, I say that represents schools of knowledge. The Africans use that one symbol to represent the deep schools of knowledge that go on internally, in the drama subatonically, and the deep schools of knowledge that go on externally, including the creation from the Creator. And so, the European having a unal dimension, a limited dimension, a linear dimension coming out of that cave experience where you can't feel and adjust to the universe, where you're at the survival level. Survival culture as opposed to developmental culture. And this developmental culture allowed the Africans to achieve the foundations of culture and civilization. And survival culture retarded other peoples. If you're in the environment of a desert also, you have unfortunately the environment that's very limited. and you only may be able to reach the level of survival. But where you have sun and land and water, you have the ingredients for developmental culture. If you master the laws of nature and you begin to put your culture and civilization in those laws of nature. So systems becomes key and crucial.
Let me just ask you, in terms of some of the great monuments that are there in Egypt along the Nile, the pyramids, the calendar, what I want you to do, if you can, as we talk about the benefit of the internal dynamics, the external dynamics, the macrocosm with the macrocosm, and relating that, can you give us some examples of what came out of that understanding in terms of things like the calendar? Can you begin to put a perspective on all knowledge?
Right. Well, a calendar would be one small manifestation of this larger process. And the calendar is directly related to what I previously mentioned in reference to the movement of the heavenly bodies. In other words, the Africans began to study the heavenly bodies and they began to see the drama of the cosmos. And so the one dating is 4100 BC, before the building of the Great Pyramids and before the unification of the Nile politically. You had high levels of culture being developed, and we don't know the extent to which it goes back even thousands of years before. But you have at that period already developed a stellar calendar, meaning the movement of the heavenly bodies have been studied and a calendar on their movement occurs. Then you also have the particular relationship of the earth to the moon. And so you have also not just a calendar based upon studying the stars, but you have a calendar based upon the movement of the heavenly body, the moon, around the earth. So you have a lunar calendar. And even more significant, or just as significant, you develop a solar calendar on the relationship of the earth and the heavenly bodies to the sun. So the Africans actually put in place the basic understanding of laws of nature that have been inherited by us today. We've got our 30-day month, we have our 12-month year, we have the 24-hour and the 12-hour breakup of the 24. So many of the things that were studied by the ancients years ago, the ancient science, we actually implement today with adjustments, etc. So what came out of this understanding of the universe and the relationship of the spiritual things to the material things and the domination of the spiritual, the foundations of human living. The foundations of studying the universe produces science, the exactness of things. The foundation of formulas that the science can be broken up into in terms of mathematical and physical science. Studying of the body produces biological science that eventually leads to medicine. Studying of the universe and the cosmos produces the astronomy and astrology that allows you to see the larger universe that you're a part of and allows you to create a dimension of you beyond you, that you are part of a greater being. And so the concept of the God within and the God without becomes the force within and the force without, or you began to see the creation in its fullest dimensions and began to relate it. So philosophy is developed in relationship to this universe that you're part of. And of course, the relationship of as individuals produces the science of living as family. So all of the basic ingredients that we're talking about to make for the larger life of the human family were found among African peoples and then shared by others. But the great tragedy is as you look at the flow of knowledge, and I again use the pyramid of formulation, we are only allowed to learn by and enhance the polarity of the European American, or if we will, white folks. And that polarity is centered around what I call the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Greco-Roman, Teutonic, Anglo-Saxon, German, Teutonic, Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, white American. Let me repeat that. The flow of knowledge that informs us and allows us to develop our system capabilities and allows us to live on the planet, unfortunately, in the modern era, comes from the control of knowledge by the Europeans. As he controlled our bodies and our lands, he controlled the flow of knowledge, and that affects our mind development. That the knowledge that we have, unfortunately, is limited to the Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Greco-Roman, Teutonic, German, Anglo-Saxon, English, white American knowledge. And in that knowledge, whiteness is enhanced and Africanness is devastated. So that there is no way that we can develop in the framework of the European knowledge formula.
Right.
That we will be forever retarded and at arrested development and just survival as long as we remain there, because the center of that knowledge is in a false, devastating formula of raising white supremacy. And so if you're there, you cannot be nurtured. So it behooves us to go to the first knowledge. European knowledge comes later because European is later. European comes out of us, if you will. But the first knowledge is the triple A. I call it the triple A. Africans, Southern Asians, Native Americans, or Mesoamericans. Is this triple A knowledge that we are missing. You go to school at 5 or 6 to start to get your certification in white supremacy, and you get a
Before then,
you get a high school diploma,
church, television.
and then you get a BA or BS, and then you get an MA, and then you get a PhD, all of it in whiteness. And at the same time, at 5 or 6 and 7 or 8, your mama starts to take you to church. And in church, you get another whitening. And then when you get on your peer level, when you have to learn the intimate interrelationship of what a man is and what a woman is, we are again stuck in a white formula of the mysteries of what life is. And then as we go into adulthood, we don't have our roles in the community as primary. We have a job, making money to survive. And so our whole formula for living is askewed and thrown out of kilter because it has been sucked into the white system of profit making by any means, which we now call the capitalist system, which at one point comes out of the feudal system. And so we need to understand what we have become caught up in this materialistic system that dominates things material and even exploits the material. Our system is founded, every system has material and spiritual and material. Our system, however, has the spiritual dominating material. And so if we don't tap into the knowledge, which is the first knowledge and the most significant knowledge and most sustained knowledge of what our people brought forth, then you are truly miseducated. I think the phrase that we use in reference to miseducation of the Negro, Carter G. Woodson, refers to basic knowledge and information coming from the world, largely coming from Europeans. But we have gone deeper since Carter G. Woodson's time to understand that the flow of knowledge coming from people of color, the melanized people, is so fundamental to living on planet Earth at the highest level that unless we have that knowledge, we are dwarfed. We are losing our human potential. So Africans' knowledge, Southern Asian knowledge, the Most Honorable Elijah Muhammad came up with the concept of the Asiatic black man. So Africa and Asia are one in terms of human development. We're just talking about geography now. The humanity that came out of Africa spread over into Asia, and then spread from Asia into other parts of the world. But you're still talking about Africans extended. And then eventually it gets to the New World. So even the New World personalities are part of the African family. So when we understand this, you have to have a new sense of biology, a new sense of anthropology, a new sense of psychology, a new sense of physics. In other words, the education that we need to teach, we have not begun to teach. A whole new structured educational system has to be put in place for us to realize our potential as human beings, reflecting the creation and the creator. And so that's the beauty of traveling around the world, seeing different parts of Africa, and saying, how could people conceive of this? And how could they conceive it and then achieve it? So they had to touch into forces beyond our current comprehension. And those are the forces now being revealed by science and mathematical formulas. And then Dr. Oyibo again stands on the cutting edge of this new dimension, which will allow us to enhance, tap into forces and powers, and put them into scientific formulas that will create a new level of human development. And so, but because the northern cradle has dominated the southern cradle, because of its technological achievements, and because of this value system of dog eat dog, we have to be able to begin to systematize ourselves and our world in order to build and resist the negative. In order to build a system, and that's key to what has to happen, you got to have three components of the interrelationship of things. Using the pyramid formula again, just to process information and data and make it real. Fundamentally, and no system can survive if it does not have an economic foundation. Every living thing has to have a productive, creative capability, and that's what economics is. Economics is your productive, creative capability, and every living thing has that. When it loses that, it begins to die. Now, this economic productive capability that every living thing has, every cell has, every subatomic element of the cell has, every human family relationship has, the environment has, the cosmos has, and the multiple cosmos and universe has. And so there has to be an economic understanding of life, first and foremost. So we've got to begin to scientifically put that in place in our learning processes. And complementing the economics is what I call the politics. Economics is your productive, creative capability. Politics is your management capability. Economics is not what they do on Wall Street. That's just a manifestation. The larger issue is creativity and productivity. Politics is not what Mayor Bloomberg does, or Mayor Koch, or Mayor Dinkins does. Politics is what we do, you do, your family does, communities do, to manage your life. And the most important thing to manage is the economics. You can't survive without the economics being managed. So this basic foundation of life, economics and politics, we have to begin to put into our systems of transmitting knowledge. And when I went to study in Europe in 1959-60, Europe was trying to rebuild because it had been devastated by the failure of European systems, first in World War I, then in the Depression, then in World War II. The economics of Europe had collapsed for half a century. And now the Europeans in 1945 were figuring out how can they rebuild their world. And the first thing they began to realize that had to be put in place is economics. So they began to put in place the coal and steel community. They began to put in place what became the foundations of the common market, economically linking Europe. Now, after you have that foundation and that solidification, then you can think in terms of how you manage that. And so they began to use the old management system, which was the European state system, but they had already begun to produce a more global management system, because in 1945, after they put together the Atlantic Alliance of England and America and the other European nations that were part of what we call the Allies, they met in San Francisco and they began to plan how to put their world back together to create a management system, and that was the United Nations. And they knew it had to be stronger and more sophisticated than what had been the League of Nations. So you began to put a management system in place. In Europe, they began to create a European Parliament. Eventually, they began to put that in place to manage this growing European economy called the common market. And my professor, Professor Olez and Professor Rubin, who were the Swiss professors that taught me in Switzerland, among the professors that taught me, and they also were part of the intellectual capability of planning the Marshall Plan. They said it's a shame that a nation like America could afford the luxury of wasting its resources and having a 100-day steel strike. And so that planted in my mind this whole question of systems analysis and the interrelationship of things and the waste of resources, that we had a strike that could not be worked out by the workers and the owners, and we were wasting this enormous abundance that was ours. And so in Europe, they had what they called economie politique. The course that I had was economie politique, economic politics in the same course. In America, you had this division. You had economics being taught in the economics building and politics being taught in the Kirby Law building. Again, the European experience was significant and important for me because I began to realize that there was much more to the world than just white America. And I began to see the Europeans had a different view of things, including myself. So the question of race was looked at and viewed from a different perspective. But the systems becomes key as something I began to master, and that's one of the contributions I'm trying to make to our intellectual inheritance. Systems linking three things: economics, politics, and culture. Economics and politics being the foundation. Economics being your creative and productive capability. Every living thing has to be creative and productive, otherwise it dies. Politics being your management capability, and every living thing has to have its economics managed properly. Every living cell has to be managed properly. All the processes in the cell have to be managed properly, otherwise you'll get retardation, you'll get imbalance, you'll get cancer, you'll get dysfunction of systems. And so the management complementing the productivity and creativity becomes something that our people need to understand. If they did understand it, they wouldn't eat the things they eat. If they did understand it, they wouldn't do the things they do. If they did understand, they wouldn't pollute water that is necessary for life, etc. So this scientific understanding of economics and politics and culture has to take place. Economics, politics, and culture has to take place. And the key to making it happen is culture. Culture is the values. Culture represents the values. Culture represents the mind. And you can have low-level values, or you can have higher values. You can have low culture or high culture. And the high culture seems to relate, if you're talking about the East, in reference to the upper chakras, as opposed to the lower chakras, the more mechanical processes. The heart-mind chakra, the spiritual chakras, as opposed to the bodily functioning chakras. But in the African dimension, the understanding of culture meant that there's a link between mind, body, and spirit. And culture is how you deal with life and the creation and the creator. And culture tells you what type of economics to develop and who to do your politics with. And unfortunately, the European mastering the understanding of systems analysis has messed with our cultural dimension, and that has allowed him to control our economics and allowed him to mess with our politics and then have us not see the true Africanism of culture. Now, by culture, from Africa, we need to study the Africans on the continent, the Southern Asians, and the Native Americans.
Mm-hmm.
That flow of knowledge is a zero in our development. In the various units of socialization, when we develop that process of nurturing, the units of socialization include first and foremost the family. Then after the family, you have the school kick in. Then after the schools, you have the churches as significant. Then after that, you have the peer group stage. And then you have the adult, young adult, and the adult stage. And then, of course, you have the ancestor, the senior, and the ancestral stage.
Mm-hmm.
Africans understood that this process of human development and community development and relationship of the human and the community, family and the community to the cosmos had to be a process that is a complete circle, controlled from before the womb to after the tomb. In other words, if you're going to have the pyramid of development take place, which for me involves ontology, your beingness. Who
Right.
are you?
Right.
And this is Dr. Wade Nobles now, and he said he got it from his great teachers like Dr. Nathan Hare. Ontology is your beingness. And as a young child, you're taught who you are. Epistemology is how this beingness is going to be enhanced. Epistemology is how do you know what you know? And axiology, at the top of the pyramid, is the values that you're going to go through life with. So our ontology has been messed with. That's what the enslavement process does. That's what mental slavery does. We don't know who and what we are. Our epistemology has been messed with. It was against the law to teach us to read and write. And then when they had to make us functional parts of their system, they had to teach us to read and write, but at the lowest possible level. And so the values that we could have and should have gotten from understanding the AAA, Africans, Southern Asians, Native Americans, Mesoamericans, the values that we could have and should have gotten to enhance our development, unfortunately which are centered around spirituality, unfortunately comes from the materiality of the European. And so even today, we will kill for a gold chain.
Yeah.
When in the African culture, the Southern Asian culture, the Native American culture, all life is revered. Life in the trees, life in the waters, life in the seas, life in the bees, as well as in the humanity. All life is revered. And now we're in a culture where things mean you can take life. That means our value system, our axiology has been thrown off center.
Correct.
And so our restoration, the good news is the gospel of Dr. J and Nana Kwekudra and Dr. Oyibo and Minister Clemson Brown. The good news is that over the last 50 years, even though we've been in 500 years of funk, in a deep hole with doo-doo piled unbelievably high, the last 50 years has allowed the African, the Asian, and the Native American, the Mesoamerican to move on the world stage and began to fight the real fight for his restoration. Over the last 500 years, when the European moved on the world stage and pushed people of color off, we fought battles and we resisted from the very beginning. And that resistance took place when Africans were pulled out of their villages and they resisted, and pulled down into the slave dungeons, they resisted, and pulled into the holes of the ships, they resisted, and resisted when they came in the New World. But that resistance has now come together with what I call the Great Awakening, with the collapse of the European systems and the coming together of this synthesis of the old African way, which I call the Maatian way.
Correct. Absolutely.
And the Ma'afa, which was the enslavement, which pulled us out of ourselves into a negative socialization. Negative socialization is socialization out of self. That's how you can keep a slave a slave. You socialize them out of self. We are now moving into a serious positive socialization into self. And it has come at the right time because science and history is on our side. And the new scientific truth has emerged, with the scientific revelations, and that's producing a synthesis to create the new African man and the new African world. And so 1945 I date to 1995 as the Great Awakening. There's been great activities going on before. You had the Paul Robesons and Marcus Garveys and the great W.E.B. Du Bois and the Carter G. Woodson. And you had, even going further back with our Great Awakening, and you had great cultures and civilizations in West Africa and the Sudanic areas and the Swahili coast. But now modern science and the latest information has come together to allow the Africans to put it in their world with a combination of who we are spiritually, which lets us know we're not the mirror of the others. We are the others. That there's only one humanity. It is us. And it reflects the creation and the creator. So once we get into our understanding of self, then this lesser self that was imposed upon us can be shed. And the renewal of Africans can go with a power unforeseen in the past. And we can link our economics, our politics, and our culture up in the most meaningful way. And our ontology, our beingness, we're the first world.
That is correct.
Not the third world or fourth world. And the whole question of our epistemology, we know there's a learning stream from the beginning of humankind through the various levels of culture and civilization into Africa and into the Nile Valley. And that learning stream occurs before any European had an idea.
Correct.
Before any European built an institution that was worthy of the name. Before any European had a culture that could be considered high culture. Before any European developed the type of civility among peoples that could produce what we call civilization. Before any European could even contemplate the universe beyond the caves and see this wonderful creation and the creator in it and the creative processes in it. So we now can think out of the box that the European had us in. We can now think out of the box that the Arab wants to put us in. We can now think out of the box that the Judeo-Christian, who took our traditions and programmed it into a low level of lesser humanity, we now can think out of that box and tap into this enormous knowledge that will allow us to think beyond any imagination that we ever had. And that's where Dr. Gabriel Ayibo has been leading us. And if we understand that and we can connect with that, we'll have a great burst on a superhighway to reconstruct the African, the new African. As long as we are limited with trying to be a part of the European, American, white supremacy box, we will be in arrested development. And if we integrate with that, with all of our being, we will have self-destruction. If we can somehow extricate ourselves from that and build with what was the foundation inherited by us, our biogenetic inheritance and our psychological social inheritance, our social, our psycho-spiritual inheritance, if we can take what was actually given to us and build with that, with the knowledge of 400 years of living in the belly of the beast, as they would say, mastering the scientific technology that the European has and wedding it with African spirituality, then you would create the new African, whose potentiality we cannot even fathom. An African at the level of 5,000 or 6,000, 7,000 years ago could conceive of the great things and then eventually conceive and achieve pyramid building and all of that Nile Valley culture. In 2004, I made the trip mostly by road between Cairo and Khartoum. The 1,005 miles between Cairo and Khartoum is one of the most extraordinary manifestations of human genius and the manifestations of the creation and the creator. And if Africans could conceive all of that and then achieve it, it shows what our potentiality is. But if our potentiality is just limited to a European achievement, and we have a white, blonde, blue-eyed Jesus in our mind, and we have integration of the European in our mind, we're doomed. You got to take whiteness out of your life. I tell my students, using the pyramid of self-development, mind, body, and spiritual development, if all you're tapping into is this European American knowledge, whiteness, then you can't develop in the fullness of the creation of the Creator. You've got to tap into the knowledge of African peoples, the knowledge of Southern Asian peoples, the knowledge of the Native American peoples. And then with that knowledge, on whatever level you can tap into it, you can begin to move into what I call your sacred mission of restoration. But as long as we're boxed in with the European and integration with him is our mode, then we're trapped. We need to integrate with ourselves. 9/10 of human family are people of color. That's the integration that we need. And once we do that and move in with the knowledge and science that we have, so we need to have the knowledge of African peoples to neutralize the knowledge of Europeans. Take what the Europeans have and use it. But if you don't have your knowledge to build on, you don't have the internal dynamic. All is coming from the external. And the external can only sustain. It cannot self-generate, etc. The internal self-generates. The external can stimulate, but it can't be the creative force that helps you move off and link things up. And so we need to take who we are as African peoples internally, and Native American peoples internally, and Southern Asians internally, take whatever external stimulus comes our way, analyze it, evaluate it, and then utilize whatever good parts of it we can and for our own development. So there's a whole nother mode of thinking that we need to be into now. Over the last 50 years, this has come to us in a revolutionary fashion. Instead of a sporadic fashion or fragmented fashion by individuals like Du Bois or Frederick Douglass or Nat Turner, it's coming with us with a spiritual force and a people force. And the ironic thing is that in 1945, while the Europeans were meeting in San Francisco in 1945, African peoples were meeting in Manchester, England, knowing that the time had come, and they seized the time to plan a future of African peoples out of the European box, out of the cave mentality, into the of the ice peoples, into the African world and the cosmos, and into the sun people's universe. And so people like W.E.B. Du Bois now no longer function as an individual. He could function with a movement of our peoples. A young Nkrumah could not only think in terms of his individual role in helping his nation, Ghana, he now could plug into this larger universe where spirits like Paul Robeson was. So you had from America Du Bois, from America Paul Robeson, from the Caribbean George Patmore, C.L.R. James. Ironically, one of our partners and one of our teachers at City College, Professor Scobie, was in the Royal Air Force, and he was at the Manchester Conference in 1945. And that's the 5th Pan-African Conference, where they came together to think in terms of systems, and to think in terms of linking these systems together, and think in terms of moving out of the clutches of the European world. And so they began to realize they need to connect their economics, their politics, and their culture in an African world system. And that's what we mean by Pan-Africanism. The relationship of the Pan, the African connectedness, and the restoration. And even greater things can be achieved by Africans in the future than in the past, because we now have the scientific knowledge that we can mesh and integrate with our spiritual knowledge and understanding. The Manchester Conference also included Africans from the continent, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, the father of Nigerian nationalism, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe and others were there. Jomo Kenyatta was there. And so you have this continental reach in 1945, and a plan, a blueprint for Pan-Africanism was laid. And many of the individuals were on the progressive side. Many of them were socialists. So economically, they were thinking of Africans in terms of a African socialism. On the political side, they were progressives, and they were thinking in terms of a unifying party of people, a people's party. And so this people's party would manage this new economics. And then culturally, they were thinking of us as a global family. So African globalism was kicking in when African peoples in Asia and Afro-Asian peoples in Asia and Arab peoples and African Arab peoples began to see themselves as one family. And they began to manifest. 1945, Manchester. 1946, the Indonesian. The African Asian population in Indonesia told the Dutch, who had been there for hundreds of years, exploiting this very rich land, they told them, you armed us to fight the invading Japanese to protect your colonial enterprise. We are now thinking outside of your box. With these arms that we have, we're prepared to die and to kill, to have a free Indonesia. 1946, Indonesia is free. 1947, India becomes free. The crown of the British, the crown jewel of the British Empire becomes free. And it wasn't just Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent approach to things. You have to think in terms of systems. Mahatma Gandhi understood economics was the key. He understood that politics manages the economics. He understood that culture keeps it all together. And so Mahatma Gandhi moved his spiritual self out of the European world into cloth that he made on his own loom, simple white garment, out of European suits made in England. And he told the Indian people, weave your own clothes and control your own world and link up with the various elements of your fractured society and develop a culture of an Indian nationalism. And so we have to see Mahatma Gandhi from an economic point of view, and a political point of view, and a cultural point of view that centered his spirituality on raising up this people. He lost his life in the process, but he had set the path. 1946, Indonesia. 1947, India. 1948, the Holy Land becomes the center of the drama of the Great Awakening. And just as you had black people from the very beginning in the Holy Land, you had them there now, peoples of color. One important black man who was in the heart of this drama was Ralph Bunche, who was working with the United Nations. But out of 48 comes this emergence of a Palestinian state and Israeli state. And there's been a war between them ever since because of the conflict between materialism and spirituality and spiritualism and the spiritual dimension. And that's yet to be worked out because of the centrality of material values as opposed to spiritual values, even though both of them claim to be a great spiritual people. But the emergence in 48 of Palestine, Israel, then in 49, the Chinese had gone through centuries of retardation and devastation, and then the revolutionary activity of Mao Zedong and the Chinese communists. But in 1949, the People's Republic emerges as the new dimension for the Chinese world. And clearly, Mao Zedong, as a communist, knew that his economics, politics, and culture was different from the communists in Moscow, because the greatest army in the history of the world, several million people, was arrayed along the Chinese-Russian border to make sure that the white communist plan and formula was not polluting the Chinese communist plan and formula. And that center of that was an understanding of the Chinese culturally as being different from the ice people of Russia. And the Great Wall of China had been built across the northern part of China to keep out the Asian ice people, the Mongols, who were considered vicious, warrior-like barbarians. And so that drama of the Great Wall, the Chinese were not insane, obsessed wall builders. They were trying to keep out this population of Asian peoples that had been surviving at this low level of desert life. And so that low level barbaric culture, the Chinese were trying to protect from, because the Chinese have a basic philosophical belief that they have a mandate from heaven to create a Chinese world. So we've got to be able to see these cultural dimensions that help to go make our world. Then in the 50s, 1952, Africa burst forth with Gamal Nasser and Naguib in Egypt, establishing for the first time black men ruling in Egypt in 2,000 years. First time in 2,000 years. So Egypt is birthed. And then that continuation in the so-called Arab world occurs when Mossadegh in 53 develops a continuation of the revolution with Iran and the Mossadegh process of trying to control the oil. 54, we began get Dien Bien Phu. The French lose a major battle to the Vietnamese as they began to start to control their destiny. 54, 55, we're moving in the streets of the southern cities of America. We've got the Montgomery bus boycott and other things taking place. And these new African, Asian nations that are emerging, because by then, Nkrumah has gone back to Ghana in the 40s to help lay the foundation for new independence. The emergence of nationalism in Africa is taking place with the French-speaking nations forming first an agricultural union called the Syndicat Agricole Africain, SAA, the Union of Agricultural Workers, formed in 1944 thereabouts. And then by 1946, this economic union needs a political arm. So the RDA, the Rassemblement Démocratique Africain, is formed. The Assembly of African Peoples is formed to manage this economic emerging process that's taking place in a dozen African nations in the French-speaking areas. 1946, a great African mind goes to France to meet his Muslim African Mouride culture meets French culture. And this, luckily, with this African foundation and the meeting of French modern culture, this brother was able to synthesize a new African, and he becomes the great mind like Dr. Oyibo. I'm talking about Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop.
Yes.
And he now takes his African foundation and weds it with the European formation, and he produces a new African. Now this process of the African foundation and the European formation is what we have to have in order to create the new education, the new socialization, the new acculturation. Acculturation, socialization, how you get your beliefs, your role models, your patterns of behavior, those processes that form that. Acculturation is how you fit into society. So we have to understand that we've been caught into a trick bag. Taking the pyramid formula again, at one polarity you have the African foundation. And all of us inherit a biogenetic package that gives us an African foundation. We are African whether we want to be or not. That's the creator legacy to us, and that's what Mother Nature stamped us. The question is, can you enhance that Africanness that we've inherited, or will you diminish it so you don't grow? And the control over us has been, like Steve Biko said, whoever controls the most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind. But in this last 50, 60 years, we've understood fully that the most potent weapon in the hands of the liberator is the mind of the oppressed. And we've taken the mind of the oppressed and we have begun to liberate it. Free your African mind. And now if we begin to take the scientific information and knowledge that we can get and blend that with this dynamic of our African foundation, we will be able to create the new African man. Mm-hmm. However, we are dogged by history. And over the last 500 years, we've been trained to worship the European. So even though we have an African foundation, mm-hmm. which is the beginning of the human foundation, mm-hmm. which is the greatest level of human development, that's in us. That's our inheritance. How we manifest it is controlled by the European formation. So you have the positive of the Maatian tradition of learning to live a spiritual life of those values of truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, reciprocity, which is the core Nile Valley values of the great building, which is the core of the African farm and villages where they live communal, cooperatively, and collectively. That truth, justice, righteousness, harmony, balance, reciprocity, we call it has reaching its peak in the Nile and the Maatian tradition. But when we were sucked out of that and into the European world of exploitation, we got into the European Maafian tradition, that great Maafa, that great devastation. And the key to that is the European formation of control of the knowledge. Garbage in, meaning the European knowledge, and garbage out can only be a disaster.
Let me ask you.
A confusion.
Let me ask you
a
that.
Perversion.
This is a nice place to begin the formation of answering the questions. Throughout the literature on Africa and Europe, the European teaches that Africans sold themselves into slavery, that we are enslaved because of our own internal structure, and that we sold ourselves to the European. Is this true? I would like for you to explain how, if we were Ma'atian, if we live by these principles, how did the Europeans come in? Where did they come first? What was their modus operandi that enabled them to overcome the African, change his worldview, and enslave him? How was it?
That's a key question that's being asked over and over again. It's being asked now as we speak, because they've just had ceremonies around the end of the slave trade. 1807, the British ended the slave trade. So now the discussions on what slavery was all about have heightened. But again, we need a systems analysis of these things. And if you have a systems analysis, you won't be trapped by what I call a paralysis of analysis. And a systems analysis lets us see the things in its larger dimension. Mm. It lets us have a macro analysis as opposed to the micro. The domination of one over another has been part of the human drama. The conflict of one over another has been part of the human drama. And so in every group and in every stage of history, you can point to situations of domination, or if you will, manipulation and exploitation. So the experience of Africans over the last 500 years is not new. It's part of the historical drama of the human family. Mm-hmm. But there's a difference that needs to be noted. That when you lack a spiritual component to the center of your life, mm-hmm. then you can actually believe that you have the ability to alienate the creator and the creation from humanity. And we have to understand the extent to which the Europeans played mental gymnastics to believe that he was God And those that weren't Europeans were not only not godly, they were the devil and the cursed. It takes an enormous shift in thinking to see the human family and divide it up in this way. And that produces a valueless value system, a morality system without morals. It produces the greatest of American leaders, such as Jefferson and Washington and Madison and Monroe, who could actually preach and teach that they believed in equality and they believed in God and they believed in liberty and justice, and actually implement an enslavement process that took people out of the human family and made them property. Mm-hmm. So you have to understand the mental gymnastics that allows that to occur. Other people's enslavement has a different dimension, or domination has a different dimension. Africans, for example, may have one group fighting another and then one group dominating another. But there are very few Africans who would believe that that physical domination of another human being allows them to spiritually dominate their ancestral spirits. Mm-hmm. You may invade an African area and an African locality, and you may dominate them, but you will pay homage to their ancestors because the ancestral spirits control the land for most African cultures. So every process of domination for the African does not become an alienation from the human family. African enslavement involved a process where, and there are traditions that establish this, that a person dominated and who was a virtual enslaved person in another culture becomes the leader of that culture. That's the story of Sundiata and the Mali Empire. There's a story of the early beginnings of the royalty of Ashanti being under the domination of the Inca, and then something happening spiritually where they come out of that domination. The great first king, Osei Tutu, is with the great priest of Konfanochi. And the learning process of this young royal with this great priest produces the beginning of the Ashanti kingdom, mythically and spiritually, that Konfanochi called for a great unifying symbol, image now, the power of image, a unifying symbol. The great golden stool was brought out of the heavens and landed on the lap of this new potential leader, and it becomes a unifying symbol for the soul of the Ashanti nation. Mm-hmm. So the Africans not only create the human dimension so strong, but they create the spiritual dimension to complement the human dimension. So even to this day, that golden stool is a unifying factor of the Ashanti. But it comes when the Ashanti king and the great priest were under the domination of another. Mm. So African and enslavement and servitude has a different dimension. Chattel enslavement, which the European developed, comes out of his type of feudalism, where for thousands of years, at least 1,000 years before African enslavement, Europeans had established a feudal system in which the European was completely dominated by the lord of the manor. Mm-hmm. That European feudalism meant, for example, the right of the first night. That the lord of the manor controlled everything on his feudal plantation to such an extent that if a young maiden at the southern part of his manor and a young man at the northern part of his manor wanted to get married, to show who was in control, even of the person of the human being, even of the reproductive rights, the lord of the manor had the right of first night, the right to sleep with the maiden before the person she was going to marry. This is the extent to which the European developed a different type of domination from others. And that different type of domination was a separation of the human from his humanity. So yes, Africans were involved. But the system that established was not an African system. The system has to be seen as a four-way system that links economics, politics, and culture for the European, that links land, labor, and resources for the European, a four-way system that begins first in Europe, in the mind of the European. He conceived of domination of the African because he had, throughout his moving into high culture and civilization, built his cultures around massive slave systems. The Roman cultures were built around massive slave systems. The Greek cultures before them were built around massive slave systems. Sparta was a fascist political state designed to produce the type of warriors that would capture other Greeks and enslave them. Sparta was the prototype of genetic pruning, that they would kill off the women children because you only needed one woman to produce many children, and they would kill off children who were not whole. If a child was born and he didn't look like a strong physical type, they had infanticide. As opposed to the Native American and the African tradition in the main, every child out of a woman's womb is a spirit.
And sacred.
And sacred. And if the child comes in with one arm, it's still a spirit. If it comes in without legs, it's still a spirit to be respected. So there's a different way you look at life from that northern cradle as opposed to the southern cradle. The Europeans put in place white slave trade before the African slave trade. And that white slave trade institutionalized itself after the fall of the Roman Empire, 400 AD, 450 AD. And it lasted for hundreds of years, where the Europeans are selling Europeans into slavery. Western Europeans are selling Eastern Europeans, the Slavic people, into Arab slavery. And so that whole history of slavery needs to be studied from the perspective of what the European put in place to enslave his own. Then you'd have a better view of the type of slavery he put in place for Africans. The same thing would be true of the Arabs. The type of enslavement that the Arabs produced in East Africa and in the so-called Middle East needs to be understood by our people. And we need to see the distinction between African domination and servitude as opposed to European. The European sees this alienation of the human spirit. The African sees the reverence for the human spirit, even if it's the human spirit of people that he has dominated. The slavery that we are talking about the last 500 years comes out of the European experience. It was conceived in Europe. The slave systems were set up. The slaving companies were set up in Europe. They had a plan to come to Africa to induce Africans to produce captives through war and destruction, which occurred. And one African was played off against another. And the Europeans had already discovered the so-called New World, where he intended to plant his economics of the plantation, but it didn't work. Europeans couldn't handle the labor. Native Americans were dying off. And then they decided to take the foundation of the human family, Africans, to bring them to the New World. So the Africans didn't have any plans of joint stock companies. They didn't have any these great companies, the Dutch West Indian Company, the Dutch East Indian Company, the Royal African Company, the Danish Company, the Swedish Company, the German Company, Portuguese Company. Europeans had that. So they had the companies, they had the ships, they had the manufacturing, they had the forts and dungeons along the coast that they could defend, that the Africans had to deal with. They had the plantations in the New World. So this four-way profit system is what built up enslavement, and it's the European at the center of it, not Africans.
We were talking about the European and European enslavement and how Europeans manipulated and set up the process and the control.
And they're continuing, as we mentioned in the beginning, images are so important. They're continuing to control how slavery is viewed. They do not want us to have a systems analysis. If you had a systems analysis, you would know that Africans, there would have, if it was up to Africans, there would not have been could not have been a transatlantic slave system. It was a European system conceived, it was a European system maintained, it was a European system sustained. There were some African players in the system. Just as, if you want to parallel, the drug trade, international drug trade today. You have on the corners of our cities and our towns, black and Latin youngsters selling drugs. But it's not their system. They are tools of the system and victims of the system. It's an international system with heavy money laundering from big banks and corporations, offshore operations involving billions of dollars governments involved, etc. So the international drug trade cannot be put on the backs of these youngsters that are on the street corners, and neither can the slave trade system be put on the backs of Africans. Because if it was just an African significant operation, it couldn't have survived. You'd still have people standing on the shores of Africa waiting for ships to come if it was an African operation.
Mm-hmm.
Africans didn't have the transatlantic ships that the Europeans developed to allow him to have transferred tens of millions of people out of Africa to the so-called New World. The Africans didn't have the armed technology that the European had developed in wars of Europeans fighting Europeans, white on white crime. The European developed this war technology because he was constantly in a war footing with each European fighting each other. The French, for example, when I studied European wars, the Europeans were fighting hundreds of years war. The period of Joan of Arc, 1300s in the European history, is the period of the first 100 years war. The 1300s, the English and the French were fighting for over a 100-year period. The second 100-year war is the period of the establishment of the American nation. In other words, the French and Indian Wars, the War of the Spanish Succession, the American Revolutionary War, the French Revolutionary War, the Haitian Revolutionary War, the Napoleon Revolutionary War. All those are part of the second 100 years war with England and France at each other. So when you talk about the Europeans, they have a war culture that's more devastating than anybody has seriously studied, and it needs to be studied because slavery involved a war culture, the slave system. The Europeans built forts and castles along the coast of Africa that were military operations.
Mm-hmm.
They had fleets of ships. Dozens of ships would sail, not only to trade, but to conquer.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if this was an African operation of any significance, you wouldn't have had the fortifications along the coast. You wouldn't have had Europeans playing off one African group against another, with the Dutch, for example, having a special relationship with the Ashanti. And the Ashanti bringing their captives to Elmina, where the Portuguese started the enslavement process, and the Dutch took it over. And they started in 1482, and when they built Elmina, the trade, and the Dutch took it over in 1637 because the Protestant nations that emerged out of the conflict of the contradictions of the Catholic Church, the Protestant Northern European nations fought to take the slave system from the Catholic nations. And this struggle over this was happening before there was an Ashanti kingdom, before there was a Dahomean kingdom. The Europeans had already been posturing themselves to control this enormously profitable system of the transfer of Africans to their plantations in their ships, and the making of and selling of Africans on their auction blocks, and the selling of Africans to plantations that produced products that they sold back to Europe. So you had a profit made in fitting out the ships in Europe. Mm-hmm. And the beginning of European industrialization and manufacturing came out of that. You had a profit made in fitting out the ships and also insuring the ships. So the insurance companies that later become great, like Lloyd's of London and Barclays Bank, the funding of these operations come out of the great fortunes of Europe and the banking system of Europe. And one of the first persons in England to be a part of this slavery process was Queen Elizabeth I. Mm-hmm. And in fact, we never think in terms of her as being a person who helped to get the English involved in enslavement, but she financed the Sea Dogs. They called them the Sea Dogs. Mm-hmm. John Hawkins, Sir Francis Drake, Sir Walter Raleigh. She knighted two of them because of their raiding of the Spanish galleons and ships coming from Spain with the wealth of the New World, from Africans that working in the fields and in the mines. The European Protestant nations were trying to rip this off. And the Dutch and the English had a partnership to rip off, the Dutch and English Protestant nations had a partnership to rip off the Spanish and the Portuguese nations that had initiated the slave trade system, blessed by the Pope. The Pope gave them the green light. The various papal bulls in the 1400s gave the Europeans the green light to enslave the other, to enslave the infidel, to enslave the non-Christian. So the looking at the slave system gives you understanding that's much deeper than focusing on a circumstance or a country or an individual. For example, I call this missing the forest for a few trees. Mm-hmm. So we see the story of Equiano, Gustavo Basso, who came from inner Nigeria and marched hundreds of miles to the coast, mm-hmm. and went to enslavement and then was able to survive it and write about it. Mm-hmm. So we focus on him, and Henry Louis Gibbs, the Truth Skates, the professor at Harvard, talks about him, and we feel for his pain and suffering of experiencing the long march down to the sea, but we miss the system that produced that long march, mm-hmm. the system that sustained it, the system that when it collapsed or was destroyed, put it back in place. And that system process comes from the European. Mm-hmm. Africans, and very few of them, great chiefs or kings, participated as a collectivity. Two that are remembered in a serious way is Dahomey, the ancient kingdom of Dahomey, which became so involved that their whole culture was perverted around captives for the enslavement process, and a whole series of wars with the Yoruba nations, etc., occurred. And then at a point, the Ashanti nation was not founded on enslavement, it was founded on an independent royalty, but eventually the Ashantis didn't come down to the sea to become involved. European emissaries were sent up to them to involve them. So they did not create this. The Ashanti nation is an inland kingdom. It's not a coastal one. The Fantis and the Edina, the Almina peoples and whatnot are the coastal peoples. But if the Europeans play each other off, like the Dutch, mm-hmm. got control of Almina 1637, there's no Ashanti involvement in the slave trade. It's already been functioning for over 100 years or more. Okay, the Ashanti nation is not even born yet. It's born later, and that's when the Dutch sent emissaries up to the Ashanti to involve them, arming them so they can fight with their neighbors, the Fanti. And then when the Ashanti get prisoners, they bring them to the Dutch, and the British arm the Fanti, so when they get prisoners, they bring them to the Dutch. So you had the Ashanti taking prisoners to Elmina for the Dutch, and the Fanti taking prisoners of the Ashanti and taking them to Cape Coast Castle. So when we see those two castles, dungeons that we go to all the time, we need to see the Dutch and the British in intrigue and sucking the Africans into their system and creating wars and rivalry that went on that still goes on now. They didn't exist before the European arrival, but they were furthered by the European because of his diabolical scheme to create captives. And this went all along the coast of West Africa, down into Central Africa, Southern Africa, all around to Fort Jesus in Mombasa in Kenya. You had this process of divide and conquer.
How did they do it? Give us some examples.
Well, one of the things that the Portuguese had done, and they were the first slavers, because the Pope had given them the right to enslave infidels, and coming out of the Crusades, 500 years of fighting with the African Arab Moors, the church had this Islam-Christian controversy that had been going on for hundreds from 1095, when Urban I proclaimed the Crusades, up until the 1400s. So you're talking about almost 500 years of this conflict involving Islam and Christianity. Finally, in 1492, 711 AD, African Arab Moors leave North Africa and they go into Spain. they conquer Spain and Southern Europe, and they bring high culture and civilization, and you have a golden age over the next 500 or 600 years, 700 years. And the golden age of the Moors, the great building of the cities, the literature, and the combination of Arabic culture and North African culture with the ancient learning of the Greeks and the ancient learning of the Africans produces a renaissance in Europe. But this conflict of the Catholics with the Islamic African Arab Moors also has a dimension which I just mentioned of white slave trade. The Christians, including the popes, sanctioning the enslavement of Eastern European peoples who were not Christian, who would be considered pagan, and warring against them and getting captives and sending them into Arab slavery. So the white slave trade not only involved white people dominating other white people, it involved white people in Western Europe selling Eastern European peoples into Arab slavery. In fact, the term slavery does not attach to African peoples. The term slavery, S-L-A-V-E-R-Y, those first four letters represent Slavs. So the Slavic peoples become the prototype of enslaved peoples hundreds of years before African enslavement. But the European process begins with the Portuguese, and the Portuguese had developed a special relationship of enslaving Africans along the coast of Africa and taking them back, captive Africans back to Portugal. So before you had the discovery of America, you had a small enslavement process by the Portuguese who came along the coast of Africa with their warships and were able to raid for enslaved Africans. Once Africans began to realize that this greater firepower was in the midst of these Europeans, then the Europeans began to play one off against the other and would offer one superior weapons to allow him to dominate and defeat another. So the Europeans had a plan. That's why I say it's a conspiracy. And each European developed a different technique. The Portuguese had reached a point where they did not come to Africa with their women. So they began to create a mulatto caste that worked the slave system for them. And they would have African mothers, so they would have the African mother tongue. But they would have formation by the European fathers, and so they could become the middleman of this trading system. So it's much more complicated, much more detailed than most people realize. And most people don't realize that most African chiefs were not involved in selling their people into slavery. In many instances, they were involved in defending themselves against people, other groups that had been induced to raid them, you see. And so we have part of this now. We have this multiple deaths by our people in the so-called gangs, organized turfing for control of the drug traffic. So apply that analysis to enslavement and you get a better understanding. But I say, without a doubt, that the system was conceived by the Europeans, maintained by the Europeans, sustained by the Europeans, and the Europeans profited in a four-way profit system that was so enormous that it transformed Europe from an agricultural, mercantile trading economy to an industrial economy, to an economy of monopoly corporations. And the prototype of the corporation are the joint stock companies established to run the slaving system. The model and the prototype being the Dutch West Indian Company, which was established in 1621. And these companies were parastatal. In other words, they had economic, political, and cultural responsibility. Economically, they were set up to control land and labor and resources. Politically, they were allowed to have an administrative arm that they could set up colonies. Culturally, they created the concept that they were chosen by God to do this. So they developed, all of these Europeans developed the concept of white supremacy, that God had chosen them to to enslave other peoples of color. So that we need to look at the beginning with the Portuguese and how the corruption of the Catholic Church produced the Protestant Reformation. And so Spain and Portugal, being the Catholic nations, were faced in the 1500s with the emergence of a Northern European Protestant element that had to begin to systematize itself, get its economics together, get its politics together, get its culture together. So the birth of the English nation with Henry VIII in 1631 and 32 needs to parallel the emergence of the Dutch to set up the slaving companies